Hey everyone. Really nice to be here. This is how I'm going to talk the whole time. I want to thank David Waddington and Tessa McLean for inviting me here to speak with you. This is always an honor to exchange ideas. And let's give a hand for Ian on tech. And I am thrilled to be here to talk to you about controversial issues in the classroom and the death of democracy, which, as you know, is everyone's favorite lighthearted topic for a professional development day, right? I know you thought you were getting Giggles the clown or something. Let me start with a quick story about my daughter, who's now 28 and in finishing up med school. But when she was little, do you know the Magic Treehouse books? None of those. I was reading her the one of the Magic Treehouse books, and she, saying they go up into the Magic Treehouse, and Mahal stopped and asked me a question. She said, "I don't understand. How do they get to these different places?" And I started to answer the question. They go up to this treehouse. It's magic. They do this and this. And in the middle of my answer, she started walking away. And I said, Michal, I haven't finished answering your question. And she said, but Daddy, I've finished listening. So I know it's the beginning of the day, but if you finished listening before I finished talking, don't worry. I understand. I've had it before. Um, I want to start today. It's really nice to be here, and I look forward to our discussion and hearing a little bit about what all of you are up to as well. But I'm going to start, if you'll indulge me, with a thought experiment. And what I want to do is if you can close your eyes for a minute and imagine you're sitting here. Well, you don't have to imagine that. You are sitting here. And and you suddenly feel your chair start to shake a little bit. And it starts jiggling backwards and forwards. And soon you start rising a little in the air. The chair's just sort of rising up. And you stop there for a second, but then it keeps rising. It goes through this very low ceiling. It goes through the next floor of the building and the next, and it goes through the roof. And you're outside. There's light snow outside. You're in the air. You're going up. You start to see Gatineau. You start to see Ottawa. You start to go higher and higher. You see Ontario, and you go zoom through the atmosphere, through the stratosphere, and into space. And now you are floating in space. And you see that beautiful pearl of an Earth turning below you. It's very pretty up there. Remember, this is a thought experiment, so you can breathe and you're not too cold. And we can do anything we want in a thought experiment. And you watch the Earth spin, but after a while, you feel your chair shaking again, and you start to go down, and you start to sink down, down, down through the stratosphere, through the atmosphere, into the air. You see the cities again, down, 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 and you go through the roof of a building, through several floors, and boom, you land. And now you can open your eyes and imagine this. You're in a classroom, and you're in a classroom somewhere on the planet. But here's the catch. You don't know where. And you can't tell by the clothes people are wearing or the dress or the food or the language. I can make anything up, right? It's a thought experiment. Uh, and you sit there and you watch a lesson go on for, let's say, half an hour. Here's my question for the thought experiment. After watching this lesson, would you be able to tell whether you had landed in a country that is a democracy, Canada, France, Switzerland? I used to say the United States, I'm not so sure. Um, or whether you had landed in a totalitarian dictatorship or a theocracy or a country led by a military junta. At first, it sounds like I'm asking you a kind of facetious question, right? Because we'd all like to say, of course we can tell. I mean, schools in Canada would look nothing like schools in North Korea or China. They'd be completely different. But when you think about it, a lot of lessons that go on might be very similar. Teaching a foreign language, teaching fractions, um, teaching the composition of soil, the life cycle of a glowworm, how to read, right? All of these things could be at least very similar in classrooms in a democracy or in a totalitarian dictatorship. So this begs for me an even more interesting question, and this is what I want to talk about today. What, if anything, should be different in schools in a democratic society than in those in a dictatorship, right? Should anything be different in our classrooms than in the classrooms in North Korea, other than the obvious, we teach different history and so forth? Should anything be different, right? That's what I want to take up today. And you can imagine, of course, that I think there should be differences, because in a totalitarian dictatorship or a fascist regime, there are certain expectations of citizens. And those expectations are to follow the rules, to do what the leader says, not to question things, right? To go to work, come home again, and obey the law. Some of those have aspects that are true in our society too, but in democracies, we have very different requirements of citizens. In democracies, we're supposed to determine the direction of our own lives, ideally. Right? We're supposed to participate in making decisions about how we live and how society is organized. That requires a certain set of skills and habits that people in totalitarian dictatorships do not want citizens to have. Right? And actually, before I go on, let me make this just a little more complicated, because here in the West, we like to say democracy good, dictatorship bad, right? It's a pretty clear thing. But I want to even complicate that, okay? Let's call the dictatorship we're thinking about in this experiment a benevolent dictatorship. And if Matt doesn't mind, I'm going to make him the benevolent dictator. Yes. So Matt is a dictator. What he says goes, but he's the dictator, right? But he has the best interests of the people in mind. He's not squirreling away money to the Cayman Islands. He's not giving plum positions to his relatives and friends, right? He wants to do what's right, right? He's trying to organize society in the best way to maximize everything for the most people. And he really, that's his commitment in life, okay? But he's still a dictator, right? Even in Matt's dictatorship, he wants to do the best. Matt doesn't really want to hear what any of us think. Maybe he has a small group of advisors that he makes decisions with, but basically he'll make a decision in the best interests of the people, and that decision goes, okay? So in Matt's dictatorship, citizens are not to question his decisions, right? They're to follow them. They're not to participate in looking at problems around them and trying to solve them. The government will do that. Sure, they're supposed to be nice to each other. They might, help an old person across the street. They might give blood when blood is needed, but that's the sort of civic engagement that we want. In the democracy, we need people who are actively looking at laws, policies, customs around them, and thinking about how we can improve them, thinking about where our positions lie on various issues, and at the very least, electing leaders that we think jibe with our positions, but in a stronger democracy, participating in all kinds of ways, writing letters to the editor, protesting, getting involved in community organizations, right? Organizing things in the communities. So these are different, and it would seem weird to me if we didn't think that creating that kind of society with those requirements of citizens doesn't require schools to do something different than in Matt's country. Right? Okay, Matt, I'm letting you off the hook now. It must be. And so what are those things? And I also want to say that it's not new that schools would be implicated in the idea of, can we have a democratic society, right? As long as democracy has been around, education in some form or another, and democracy in some form or another, has been implicated in making democracy possible. It goes back at least to this Thomas Jefferson quote, which I will paraphrase badly, but he said, If the people are not well educated enough to govern their own affairs, then the solution is not to take that power of governance away from them, but to educate them. Right? That you need an educated populace in order for democracy to work. I don't know, we'll talk about what's going on in the US, and that might challenge some of what I'm saying because it is a highly educated population, but we'll get there soon. So, so what should a classroom in a democratic society look like? Who speaks? Who's silent? What's going to change before the CCQ curriculum and after? Right? Are students learning answers, or are they learning how to ask questions? Are perspectives debated, or are they avoided because we want to avoid controversial issues? So I think the point I want to make here at the beginning is that democracy does not live in a constitution alone, right? It lives in classroom culture because these are the people who are citizens and are going to be in positions of making decisions about how we should all live. And democratic values are not, inherited biologically, right? They're taught, or they're not taught, or something else is taught. So where are we today when we're discussing all these things? When we think about what we should do as teachers, as educators, to educate people for democracy. Oh, let me say one other thing. When people say democratic teaching, they mean a lot of different things, right? You ask 10 people what they mean by democratic teaching, they'll say different things. And let me suggest at least 3 of what people mean, just so we get the same vocabulary. One is they mean teaching about democracy. This is very common. We learn about how Parliament works. We learn about how a bill becomes a law. We learn about how legislation happens, who's allowed to be in Parliament, how old you have to be president, right? We have learned all these like weird and funny facts about democracy, and you learn how it works. That's teaching about democracy. Almost every school does that, right? In some form or another. The second thing people mean is teaching for democracy, meaning how do we prepare students for democratic life, for participation in democratic life? That's different than teaching about democracy. It might require that people know about democracy and facts about democracy, but that is definitely not enough, right? Knowing how Parliament works is very different than getting involved and participating in shaping civic life. So teaching for democracy might have strategies like bridging to community organizations, what some people call community service learning, and tying it back to the curriculum, or action civics, or talking about real life examples that are happening around us, engaging kids in asking questions and thinking about how they might contribute to answering those questions, right? It's preparing them to be participatory citizens in a democracy. And I said there were 3. The third thing that I think, and I'm sure there are more, you can think of more, but a third thing that I think people talk about, are thinking about when they think democratic teaching, is teaching democratically, right? This means making your classroom more democratic. I taught a course a couple years ago on democracy in education, and the student was, asking me something about them controlling the curriculum. And I said, oh no, I'm sorry, you misunderstood. This is a course about democracy, but it's not a democracy. I'm the king. So teaching democratically is one approach to pedagogy, right? You let kids participate in deciding the topics for the course. You might have them set the classroom rules, all kinds of ways of participating where you're simulating a democracy. A lot of people, to make this a little more complicated, say to teach for democracy, you have to teach democratically, because otherwise it's like teaching swimming without swimming, right? Something like that. But not always, right? How many of us learned a lot about, or were politicized and made us wanting to engage in democratic form of life because we heard a great lecture from a professor or from something, right? It's not a one-to-one relationship, but certainly we can understand, sounds like a good idea to, have practice in democracy. So these are 3 things that people mean. And what I want to just mention now is that for most of what we're talking about this morning, I'm going to be talking about teaching for democracy. How do we prepare kids for democratic life? And that might include teaching democratically, but it might have a prerequisite of teaching about for democracy, but I'm not interested in the teaching about. We know a lot about that, and all schools do it, right? Whether kids learn it, I don't know, but we've all gone through the civics education classes of some form or another. Sometimes people call it death by civics, where we are forced to learn these facts about how government works. And I don't mean to diminish that completely. Of course, it's important for us to know some of those things. But what's the backdrop that we're talking about this here, right? Like, where are we today? I'm sure many of you are up on the news. I'm just going to give you a few statistics that that may be becoming less and less surprising, right? I'm going to start with a couple of US statistics, okay? In 1995, long time ago, 1 in 16 Americans agreed with the idea that it would be a good or very good for the military to run the country. Okay, 1 in 16. Surprisingly high number, but still pretty low, 1 in 16. Today, 1 in 5 agree with that statement. More than 1 in 3 Americans think democracy is a bad way to run the country. And maybe we can understand that, seeing what's going on right now. 1 in 3, this is a very popular question asked on surveys. 1 in 3 would like to live under a political system in which a strong leader could make decisions without being bothered by the legislature or the courts. This is disturbing since this is what we're actually watching, right? But that's the statistics. In Canada, just under 1 in 4 Canadians feel the same way about that question, right? A strong leader who could make decisions without interference from Parliament or the courts. In other words, an autocracy. We're getting close to Matt's country, right? But here's what keeps me up at night. When you ask young people that question, that figure can either go up by a third or even double, depending on the population. So what do we have around us, right? What world are young people growing up in? We've seen what's happened in many countries, right? In Hungary, with Viktor Orban, in Poland, with Erdogan, in Brazil, in India, with Narendra Modi. There's far-right movements in France, in Germany, and then, of course, right in our neighbors to the south, in the United States. I'm from New York, by the way, so I can take lots of pot shots at the United States without. In fact, it's funny because I go back and forth a lot, as Dave knows, and sometimes I feel like I'm one of these characters in a dystopic sci-fi novel where I go to the future and then I come back to the present and say, you can't believe what I've seen. Don't go there. This is horrible what's going on down there, right? Because as much as we'd like to not think this, what happens in the US tends to have a several-year delay and then seep across the border in some form or another, usually kinder and gentler, but nonetheless have an impact on us here. And we've already seen that in the style of our politics and the things being called for. We saw it, just another good example that it's not about this, is standardized testing, right? The obsession with standardized testing in the United States and high stakes testing, which narrowed the curriculum. If we have time, we can talk about this a lot, but did a lot of damage to education. A few years later, seeped across the border, and the tests weren't as high stakes, but they were as omnipresent, right? Testing kids all the time on the idea that we need to test to know what we're doing in education. And that had similar impacts on the curriculum here. So we're not immune in Canada, right? But the youth statistics I cited, to me, means that democracy is not self-winding, right? We can't just say, well, we have a democratic culture, so we're done with that, right? Clearly not. 250-year-old democratic culture to our south, and it's disappearing like that, right? In ways that even people like me who've studied this could not possibly have imagined, right? just almost overnight from one, charismatic idiot who was vulnerable to that. And it's funny because the founders of the Constitution, of course, were protecting against exactly someone like Trump. I mean, they that was who they had in mind, right, when they wrote the Constitution. But I don't think they could have imagined an entirely corrupt political party, entirely corrupt, an increasingly corrupt court system, and so on. So it happens quickly. Political scientists used to talk about a term, democratic consolidation, which is when a country has such a long political history of democracy that it's impossible to imagine any other route to power other than through the ballot box, right? So they call those consolidated democracies. They were so consolidated that nothing could possibly happen. In the last decade, political scientists increasingly talk about what they now call deconsolidating democracies. These are democracies that are backsliding, right? They were once considered consolidated, and they are now under threat of losing that democracy entirely. And we know that democracies today don't collapse under coups. There's not a tank riding its way into the White House or anything else. They erode, or they're deliberately eroded, right? It starts often with attacks on educators and on journalists. And there's a lot of fear of speaking honestly, both in the classrooms and outside. Now, I'm not suggesting that's where we are, but I do know from talking to many, many teachers and doing research that when it comes to controversial issues in classrooms, people are very uneasy about it. Right? We'd like to avoid them. Schools would like to avoid them. Teachers don't want complaints from parents. Principals don't want complaints from parents. Nobody wants to be in the news media about pushing a particular agenda. And so we like to push controversial issues to the side, right? Should we have discussions about whether or not religious symbols should be worn in schools, right? If controversial issues are forbidden in classrooms, then it's difficult to engage some of the pressing questions that are examples of democratic life. So you see what I just said there. Yes, in society, we're having the debate of whether religious symbols should be in schools, and then we wonder how we should implement that with classrooms. But why isn't that debate itself in the classroom, right? Why aren't kids learning about that kind of debate? And it's just one example, which I'm using, of course, because of recent political developments in Quebec. The new culture and citizenship in Quebec curriculum, we have to think about these, right, in the context of backsliding democracy that we're experiencing. And perhaps one of the most important safeguards against democratic backsliding is teaching critical thinking, right, in a way that wouldn't be taught in that dictatorship. Right? Critical thinking means, in the way I'm using it, the ability to look around and ask difficult questions about policy, about the direction we're headed, about how we want to live. Amanda Anderson is a literary theorist who I learned about from my wife, who's an English professor. And she said that she thinks that all literary theory is basically preoccupied with the question, or should be preoccupied with the question, of how should we live? And I love that question because that's what I think education should be preoccupied with. How should we live, right? That is democratic engagement at its finest. That's what we're supposed to be deciding. How should we live? And the reason that I also like that question is that it's a very radical question, in that just posing the question, how should we live, means that we have choices about how we should live. It doesn't mean that there's however we're living is just the only possible way to live, right? It's like the air we breathe, or it's just natural. It's genetic, No, we choose how to live, and different countries choose different ways. Different societies have chosen different ways. And we can talk about the pros and cons of different ways to organize society, how resources are distributed, right? Who gets rights and who doesn't, what rights. All of those things are decisions we all make. So when we ask, how should we live, we're asking a quintessentially democratic question. I want to also say that this topic is not just academic, as they say to me. It's quite personal. Um, both my parents were born in Germany. My mom in 1928 and my dad in 1927. And my mom was born in Frankfurt, my dad in Karlsruhe. And my dad, during the war, left Karlsruhe with his parents, and my grandfather kind of had a sense of what was coming, and he had already gone to Lisbon to arrange with a cousin to set up work and a little bit of a life for them there. And they fled to Lisbon, and that's where my dad grew up for most of his childhood. My mother was not so lucky. They stayed until 1939, when my mom was chosen, thank goodness, to be on a kinder transport to Switzerland. Most kinder transports went to England. She went to Switzerland. Kinder transports are trains that were organized for children, kinder, to get out of Germany when adults were no longer being allowed to leave. Eventually, no one was allowed to leave. And my mother remembers, well, actually, I was in the Frankfurt train station a few years ago. I was waiting for a train to Prague, and I was looking around and all of a sudden just realized that it was almost exactly 80 years before that my mother had stood at this very same train station, and actually the Frankfurt train station wasn't bombed during the war for some reason, and said goodbye to her parents. And her parents brought her to the kinder transport. Actually, her father was in detention at the time, so it was her mother and her grandmother. And she remembers waving goodbye to them, and she remembers smiling so that they wouldn't be too upset. She remembers giving her a stuffed animal she had to another girl with her who was on the train, who was crying inconsolably. Um, and and she left to Germany, and she never saw her for Switzerland, and she never saw her parents again. And she was 10 years old. Um, so personally, of course, that affects me. But as an educator, I always wonder what went wrong in Germany. This is one of the most educated nations of the world. And how could it descend into such unimaginable darkness, right? And, you know, historians have many answers for that. The worldwide Great Depression, Germany's punishing defeat in World War I, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm an educator, so my hammer is education. And I can't help but wonder, what could schools have done differently, right? What might schools have done differently? What should American schools be doing differently? And what should our schools be doing differently to make sure something like this never happens again? Um, so, and in fact, today, it's about 92 years after Germany's democracy was replaced by a totalitarian Nazi regime. And today we know that popular support for democratic governance is at the lowest it's been for decades. US is a loud example, but Canada is the quieter one that we think we're immune, but I don't know that we are. We thought the United States was immune too. So we have to push back, and education, I think, is the place to start. John Dewey said that democracy is born anew with every generation, and education is its midwife. I love that quote. Democracy must be born anew with every generation, and education is its midwife. In other words, we can't take commitments to democratic life for granted. They have to be taught, right? And schools have to be a part of that. So what do we deal with as teachers and as educators when we're doing this really on the ground? What's the nuts and bolts of this? Well, I go back to what I was saying, is that nobody likes controversy, right? It's much easier not to engage controversial issues in classrooms. And one way to do that, and Dave has written on this, is to pursue something called neutrality, right? Or balance. So if we're going to discuss, one way is avoidance, right? Let's not talk about these issues at all. No place in the classroom, do it at home, learn about it on the internet, right? A questionable decision, right? Talk to your friends. And avoidance is big. We do a lot of avoidance, right? But another way is, okay, let's talk about controversial issues, but we have to stay neutral. And by what we mean by that is that we're going to have balance and we're going to present one set of ideas for 15 minutes and then present the opposing position for 15 minutes, right? But balance is harder to find than I think we assume. Sure, there's multiple perspectives, and let's just give equal time, and then kids can decide where they are, right? But is that really how it works? Because um, avoiding controversy in the classroom and presenting neutrality doesn't make education neutral, right? What it does is reinforce the status quo. Whatever the mainstream position is, if we present balance, we're going to reinforce that position. We could take a silly example. Some scientists say that smoking is dangerous. Others say it's not, that the science is not settled. That looks balanced, right? We present both sides. But in reality, one side is supported by decades of medical research, and the other is funded by corporations wanting to protect their business interests, right? So how do you seek balance in a situation like that, right? Presenting both sides as equal is certainly not neutral. It created doubt where the evidence was overwhelming, and the result was a loss of millions of lives. Today, we could talk about it in terms of climate change. We could talk about it in terms of voter fraud. We could talk about it in terms of any number of issues, right? So neutrality is not as easy as it sounds. I can go even without those kinds of examples. Let's say we want to talk about the different possible economic systems that could be used to organize society, right? One is free market capitalism, which is what we live under. Another is, I don't know what you want to call it, more regulated capitalism, socialism, any other system, right? It's pretty hard to get kids to think critically about all those different systems because we are immersed in one system, right? Our whole lives have been in one system and everything around us promotes one system. I'm not saying I have no position on which system is better or worse or how we should do it, but to engage those questions of how we should live takes a lot of work. It's not just a question of presenting balance, right? As Howard Zinn said, you can't stay neutral on a moving train, which is nice. So with the CCQ, to the extent that this could result in teachers fearing controversial issues discussions around things like culture, identity, and power, it could be problematic, right? To the extent that it might enable it, and some people do look at it that way, it might be good. But avoiding the conversations is definitely not neutral, right? It's not apolitical. It just hides dominant viewpoints and hides issues of power. So equal time is not the same thing as intellectual honesty. And not taking a side is often choosing the side that has already won. So let me begin where I began. Let me end, sorry, where I began with the classroom. And then I look forward to having discussion on all this. If, again, someone visited your classroom from another country or from another political system, from another future, what would they see? What would they see in the thought experiment that I just did? Would they see students memorizing safe answers and regurgitating them back? Or would they see young people learning how to argue honestly across differences, listen generously, and care about a world that's not always kind or easy? Because I think that, more than any curriculum document, is what democracy looks like in real life. And unfortunately, the curriculum document can't tell us how to pull that off pedagogically. But I do know that if we start treating difficult questions as dangerous, then something is wrong in the way we're teaching. Not with the teachers, but with the democracy, right? That enables us, tells us what we can and cannot teach. So my hope here is not that schools will be quieter, but that they will be braver and louder. If we have a chance of protecting democracy, it won't be because someone finally fixed social media or the algorithms or something. It will be because teachers kept asking dangerous questions in safe rooms and made safe rooms for dangerous questions. And that's what we need to do with our students. Let me close with a quote from my favorite educational philosopher, Maxine Greene. Maxine was a good friend of mine and a mentor. She died some years ago. She was 97. And she once said this. She said, "The purpose of education is to comfort the troubled and trouble the comfortable." So what she meant by that is, of course, schools need to be safe places where students feel safe, where they feel safe from bullying, from harm, from being ridiculed, safe to ask difficult questions, and so on. But we can't stop there in a democratic society, right? Because we also need to make students uncomfortable, uncomfortable with the way the world is, uncomfortable with the things that need to be fixed, and teach them that they are part of the solution. Thank you.